console. And once we do that, we're going to find in Pro Tools this type of view. You might see this view as well. So whatever view you're seeing, you're going to go over to Window and you're going to choose Mix. Okay, the Mix window is your traditional analog console. The Edit window is your tape machine. So if you were to think about how old school analog recording was done, you would have a tape machine and then you would have a mixer. Same thing in Pro Tools, right? So this is your tape machine, this other one is your mixer right over here. Okay, so we're going to be doing our mixing on this session right over here. So if we take a listen, okay, sounds like some pretty serious drums. Now, if you weren't hearing that, there's a few different options, okay? If you go to Setups and Playback Engine, okay, there's now a different option to choose which playback engine or which sound card on your machine you're going to use. So for me, I want to use the built-in output. Okay, once I use the built-in output, it's going to say, well, selecting this engine is going to automatically close the session. It'll save it and then reopen it up. So just click yes. And it'll reopen up the entire session once you hit OK. It's another weird part. Now when you hit play, okay, so just a reminder, this is your tape machine over here. This is your mixer. Okay, so when we take a look at the mixer in Pro Tools versus a traditional analog mixer, I just pulled up a picture for you right now. Okay, this analog mixer channel strip right over here is comparable to what we're seeing right over here in Pro Tools. Okay, there would be a preamp. The only thing is Pro Tools doesn't have the preamp. After that, we have an EQ and then our aux sends, and then we have solos and mutes, and then our fader, which goes out. Okay, what we're not seeing over here is our routing matrix yet. Okay, and we're going to get to that spot in a second. So in our traditional audio console, we have aux sends and then EQs. This is actually sometimes flipped depending on which audio console it is. Okay, so we're going to have the EQs first, and then we're going to have our aux sends right over here. So if we click on one of these, this aux send will actually send out some audio across this bus to a particular output. Okay, just like over here, if I wanted to have a little bit of kick drum and snare, I would turn this up a tiny bit and turn this one up a tiny bit, and now a separate mix of kick and snare would go all the way out to, say, your headphones, or to, say, a green room speaker, whatever those were going to be, right? Down here on our traditional audio console, we have mutes and solos. Hey, there we go, mutes, solos, etc. Great. So that's the same exact type of setup. Now, this Pro Tools represents almost an inline console, and it's an inline console because all the master faders are next to each other. Okay, so here's your track sections: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Kick, snare, acoustic, guitar, rhythm, lead guitar, shaker, bass, and vocals. Those all match the tracks. This is actually the outputs of all of your aux sends. Okay, so I'm just going to turn those down. So if you were to turn up a little bit of kick and a little bit of snare, just like we did over here, the actual output fader are these aux 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so there's that. These group outputs are actually your bus outputs, or your matrix outputs, or sometimes we just call it busing. Okay, these now feed the master fader. So we have tracks, which are then going to feed individual groups, which are then going to feed the master fader. In order for us to sort of have a plan on how we're going to group these tracks so that they make sense on the other end, we're going to be taking these tracks as basically drums, bass, guitars, and a vocal. Okay, so ultimately what I want to do is I want to sum down all these 8 tracks so that I'm just mixing on 4 faders. Okay, so we're going to do it right over here. Now, if yours isn't showing groups or input and output, you're going to go over here where it says Mix Window View Selector, and you're going to make sure that the I/O is selected. Okay, so this little drop-down arrow right over here will actually turn on and turn off a bunch of different settings. One of the interesting ones is the EQ curve as well, so you can have your EQ vector going on right over here, and you can kind of see what each EQ is. So that's fun. Anyways, we want to make sure that I/O is selected as well. Okay, now we're going to take this kick drum and this snare drum and this shaker, and we're going to bring it to group number 1. Down here on the bottom, I'm going to select this and I'm going to put drum group, because I always want to label what's happening. Okay, now input, output. I'm going to take this output right over here and I'm going to select a bus. Okay, now what bus am I going to select? Well, that's going to depend on what bus is actually being selected over here on your group. Okay, so this is actually bus 11, bus 12, bus 13, bus 14, which means that this group's input is the internal busing number 11. Got it? Okay, so I'm going to choose bus number 11 as my output for kick number 1. So kick is going to bus number 11, which is actually group 1. This bus's main output is the master fader. Okay, so now for number 2, I'm going to go and make that bus 11, which is now drums group, flows the output over here to the master fader. Finally, I'm going to select the shaker, bus output number 11, because I'm going to include those in the drums, and then from there I'm going to go to group 1, because that's bus 11, to the master fader. So now if I was to hit play, so now I can move all these tracks down, and then there's my drums here. Okay, so right now I have some guitars kind of messing things up. I'm going to bring all these guitars and vocals down so that all we're hearing, kick, snare, and shaker when it actually appears in the track. I can still change the individual volumes, but now instead of just bringing all 3 faders down, if I want to adjust the drums, I just adjust 1 fader. Okay, I'm going to show you how this is going to work in one more second. Okay, so right now what I want to do is I want to make sure that my gain staging is proper. Okay, so if I'm hitting the kick, the snare, and the shaker, I want to make sure that the outputs over here are not clipping. Okay, and right now they are. So every time there's a snare drum, we have a clip. So I'm going to bring that snare drum down until I don't have any clipping. And it looks like that's a good volume right there. And there's our shaker that finally showed up. Okay, great. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a bass group. I'm just going to call this bass group. Now, it's kind of a little bit silly because the bass is only one particular track, but still we're going to do this. So here's my bass. I'm going to set that to bus number 12 because that's the bus for group number 2. Now the bass goes to group number 2. I'm going to gain stage this as well. So in the end, I'm only really adjusting this volume. I want these faders to be as close to 0 as possible without actually clipping. And there's a good mix for that. Okay, The next group is going to be our guitar group. Okay, and now I'm going to bus acoustic, rhythm, lead guitar all over to group number 3. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my output, bus to 13 because that is the bus input number for guitar group. Okay, I'm going to put these at 0 for now, just for the heck of it. Output to bus 13, output to bus 13, and now there's all the guitars. Okay, so what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to mix those guitars. I'm going to mute those other 2 tracks because I like the way they are in ratio over here. I'm going to make sure that there's no clipping. Even though I'm clicking this, it is still clipping, so I'm going to use that. This guitar's a little bit much. So this is obviously the verse portion. And that's actually a pretty good mix for just the guitars. So now if I re-add in the drums and bass, I can actually bring those guitars up in unison and I'm still staying gain staged. The bass is a little bit loud. Now that's a pretty good mix for those 3. Finally, we're going to do the vocals. Vocals is going to be on bus 14. So I'm going to take that bus to 14, bring that up to about 0, make sure that's bus 14. And I'm going to start this actually at the verse. Without question, always had my eye. It's all of my affection. It's all of the time. Without. Okay, so now we have 4 or 8 audio tracks bust down to 4, and my main mix is now happening right over here, which is the way it should happen, right? You're going to have basically 24, 48, 62 tracks. It doesn't really matter. But as long as we have 4 to 8 buses over here, we can simplify things a tremendous amount and make sure that our mix is really, really, really clear with just 4 faders, right? Because in the end, we want to just simplify everything. And I want you to know you always. Okay, so that's the end of step 1. Okay, step 2 is now we're going to go back and look at EQ and a little bit of compression, but for right now, just EQ. And we want to look through and try to enhance some of these parts. Okay, so as we go through, we're going to EQ the first particular track, which is the kick drum right over here. Now, watch what's going to happen. If I hit solo, because I want to just solo that kick drum, and hit play, nothing's happening. So let's figure this out. Why is this not happening? Well, I'm soloing the kick drum, which is right over here, but remember that kick drum is being bused to the drum group over here as well. So in order for me to hear just the kick drum, I need to solo the drum group. Now I'm hearing a little bit of snare in there, and that's okay. That snare is actually bleed through on the mic. Okay, but for right now, this is the kick drum. So how do I go through and EQ a kick drum? Well, you're going to go back to the Huber book, and you're going to look at that particular sheet that talks about all the different types of EQing for each drum or each instrument. The way I like to do it, honestly, is I'll just make sure that I am in parametric EQs all the way across for my ProTools session. And I'm going to use the search and rescue method. So basically the search and rescue method is I'm going to close my cue, which is the qualitative factor. I'm going to find some interesting portions of this drum. Like that's the low part of the drum, okay? So I'm just going to keep that there for right now. And I'm going to try to find another interesting portion in the middle. I'll turn that one off for right now. I'm keeping that frequency the way it is. Let's get to a more interesting drum part. There's really nothing interesting in here. Okay, so I'm not really worried about that. Let's find that 4K range. Okay, so there's definitely some more interesting stuff happening in this 4K range. Okay, so with an EQ, we're not going to just jack up this frequency, right? We want to do this subtly. So we only EQ things in, say, like 3 dB or 6 dB increments. So I'm going to turn on that low portion and I'm just going to increase it just a tiny bit, say 3 dB. Now remember, an EQ is the amplifier, so the input coming in versus the output coming out is definitely a little bit hotter, right? So that actually sounds a little bit better. So without the EQ, it kind of gets lost. With the EQ, it's a little bit more present. Now, with an EQ, I can also remove frequencies, which is basically what you want to do. So the inside of this kick drum just sounds like crap, honestly. So I'm going to open up the cue a little bit more and remove some of those mid frequencies. And that's going to produce a much tighter kick drum. So without EQ, with EQ. Okay, so I really didn't do much in terms of boosting, but I did remove a lot of frequencies, and that's going to be something that allows the other frequencies to actually come through a little bit more. Okay, so that's basically your kick drum EQ, and then if you can unsolo that, we can hear how this is going to cut through a little bit more. Okay, there it is. Okay, so you're going to go through and you're going to fix all of these EQs so that they're a little bit better for each instrument. And when you do that, you're going to have to go through and remix. Okay, so what I just did was I removed some frequencies of that kick drum. It was just a little bit too low, so I needed to boost it up a tiny bit. And now I'm still in ratio over there. Okay, so if I do the same thing for a snare drum, and if you're unsure about where to go for your particular snare drums or whatever, you can always check out these presets. They're not great, honestly, but they're something. So, for example, if I go to snare and I want to cut the mud of the snare, it kind of brings up a simple EQ. Honestly, that does nothing. So let's just solo that. Let's just do a snare really quick. I need to solo that, and I need to solo this. Let's find the interesting portions. Okay, now that's coming in a little bit hot, so I'm going to actually bring down the input in and out so that I can hear what's going on. Oh, so there's something really nice there. That's the low portion of the snare. Okay, so we're going to keep that. And we're going to try to find the high portion of a snare, or maybe something interesting in the middle. Oh, let's try to get rid of that ring. Okay, so we isolated that ring a little bit, so we're going to just close down the cue a little bit more, and then I'm just going to remove it. Boom. Ring is gone. Now we're hearing some of the overtones of it, but that's fine. Let's try to find some other interesting, snappy stuff. That's something interesting right there. Okay, so without EQ, a little bit dead. With EQ, it's going to cut through a lot more. I'm still clipping over here, so I'm going to actually bring down my output even more, because I don't want to clip. Clipping's bad. I want to try to get as close to that -3 as possible. There we go. That's sounding pretty good. So now when I unsolo this, that snare's a little bit lost, so I'm going to bring up the snare so it actually comes through. And I'm still clipping on the master fader, so what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to bring all of these down so that I don't clip on the master fader. So do not touch the master fader. The master fader should not be touched. It should always stay at 0. You're going to adjust these so that they're not as loud. That's much better. So we're getting a little bit there, but that's not bad. Okay, and if you see that yellow light, bring it down by a point on this side over here. Okay, so you're going to go through and you're going to EQ the rest of these, and you're going to readjust your mix as you go. And then when that's all done, you can actually go through and see where it says EQ7 over here. Well, if you click underneath, there should be additional plugins like the compressor. So this compressor Dyne 3 limiter is a really good one. So we're going to be doing another video about compression. But for right now, if you want to, you can go through and look at some of these presets and see what that compressor actually does. Like for example, if we want to just comp the drums, it just evens out that drum.